Well, Daniel, it's good to see you.
It's good to see you.
I know. People, they won't know, but it's been a bit.
It's been a bit. I feel like, the episodes keep coming out. And I texted you last night. I was like, this is fun. I feel like this was my highlight of my week for a while. Now we're back together doing this.
I know. It's so sweet. I'm glad it was your highlight. It was
Your Lily.
a burden. Every week I was like, Danny again.
I bet it was.
No, it wasn't.
Well, I was thinking about this. This is close to when we started because we started mornings too. Like it was a different vibe early on. We were in the summers, and then it was like a mad dash to get it done before the evening for a while. But now we're back in vacation mode.
Yeah, I'm in vacation mode, and it feels like I have nothing to do with this today.
Yeah.
It's pretty nice.
I dig it. What are we talking about today?
All right, Danny, we're going to put you in the hot seat today.
I love it.
So it's been so awesome. Like, do you get some DMs?
Yeah, I get.
About this podcast? I don't care about regular DMs you get.
I do. I get a lot of personal texts, and then for a while, I get a lot from like pastors and people that reach out and stuff, and
that makes sense.
That kind of thing. And so I get a few.
Yeah, I get a good amount of just people being like, thanks for sharing your story, made me feel less alone, like all that. And those like always mean so much to me. Like and it's fun when it's people you know, but it's also fun when people like just found your Instagram and are like, I just need to tell you this. Like it's been really sweet. But something that I've seen in a lot of the messages I've gotten is people have said like their divorce in some way was maybe like a catalyst in their deconstruction, or it's added a lot of complication to it, or it's just been a hard thing. And I was like, that's interesting that you're messaging me that. That's wonderful. But like we have a co-host who has been divorced and it isn't me.
Expert in the topic.
So if you're willing to share, I just kind of want to hear about your divorce and how like maybe how that affected your relationship with God, if it did or not. I mean, we'll like go specific questions, but I'm just setting the scene. Yeah. How do you feel about going into that?
I think it'll be great. I try to always float the line of like, because I'm fully over it and processed it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's value in diving into the story for the sake of others. But I try not to like dip into it for the sake of like building a level of resentment or seeming like I'm just like stuck there. But I think for this kind of context and process, I think it's great and could be helpful for someone that's maybe in the midst of it, or maybe they are stuck in it, to think like, here's someone else's journey. Because I think sometimes we're just like so close to it. That we don't see everything. And that was helpful for me, like hearing other people's story of divorce. And so, happy to do that.
So I guess I don't really know how to get started. Like, what happened? I'm sorry. I don't have a good starting question. So start where you want to start.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Start with your wedding day. I'm totally kidding.
I'm going to forego the what happened just for the sake of privacy. Absolutely. But I will say that there was maybe some irreconcilable differences, right, that led to us getting to where we were. And with that, though, like my divorce impacted me from a faith perspective and a life perspective.
Can we skip that? Can we get like a few details? How long were you married?
That's a good question.
And how many children did you have?
10 years.
Okay.
We were together for 10 years, married for 7, had 2 kids.
Okay.
No pets.
And then the differences... I just was ready to drive past that. Okay, and then the differences happened and you're apart.
And then we're apart, yeah.
And you were a pastor at the time.
I was a pastor.
I just want to slow it down before you get to like, that's how it impacted me in a faith perspective.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was a pastor at the time. And our church had other pastors had gone through divorce before. And so like that, it wasn't something that was foreign, right? We had a mechanism for like helping people heal and whatnot, but it wasn't something foreign to kind of who we were and our leadership. It wasn't a disqualifier. Like I remember when I was moving from Portland to St. Louis, I had mentioned like, this church is so cool. They have one of their campus pastors is divorced. And this person was like, they let divorced people be pastors.
Yeah.
And so I came from a place that was like very conservative on the issue.
Got it.
They would say they're all about grace, but kind of conservative on the
grace.
The grace, yeah. They conservatively doled out the grace. And then I came into a context where I actually really thought it was cool. Mm-hmm. So I would say the congregation and the staff, pastors, leadership, the denomination, like my bishop, all those people, they handled it really, really well in terms of like walking alongside me, which I think is really important. But that being said, like it did cause friction in several different areas where I had to start to like ask a lot more questions about my personal life, my friend group. So I asked questions about like my vocation and calling as a pastor. I like wrestled with that a little bit. And then I really wrestled with like the way that I talk to people that were going through divorces. Ooh. As a not divorced pastor. Like I have a lot more insight and empathy, which makes sense, right? Like it's hard to talk about death and loss until you've experienced death and loss. It's hard to talk about anything until it happens. And so experiencing divorce was an eye-opener to like, I was a pretty bad premarital counselor. So knock on wood, no one's got divorced yet that I've married, but I realized like some of the stuff I gave people and people going through divorce, I'm like, that just was not helpful. And it was just like empty kind of like catchphrases you would read on like Instagram or something. And it wasn't like really like, hey, get to the issue, you know?
What were some of the comments that you made to people who were getting divorced before you got divorced? And then like, as you were getting divorced, what did you realize you actually needed or wanted to hear?
Yeah, I would say one thing that everyone that I know that has gone through divorce is ever like before you go through it, everyone thinks that everyone wants your advice. That it's like, you know what they really want to hear from me right now is like how to get through this. So I would say things like, you guys just need to like turn towards each other more, and you guys need to like talk about like there were things that I don't think are untrue,
right?
But in the midst of what's happening, it's not helpful. And especially like I have a good friend who recently went through a divorce, and it's like I always have to realize like her story is not my story, and like my job is not to tell her what is most helpful to do. And I really try to just listen, and that's what I really realized. Like I just wanted people to like sit with me and hear how much pain I was in, and hear like how frustrated I was, and maybe provide like a little hope of what was to come. But it's like I was in a space where I was like, I wasn't ready to not be hurt. And so I was like, I'm going to sit in this for as long as I need to. And I think there's an unhealthy level of that. And I'm a pretty optimistic go with the flow guy. So I didn't sit there forever. But early on, I was like, I just need you to listen. Like I remember one of the nights that was like divorce was imminent, right? I went over to a group of my friends' house. Like I texted 4 of my friends. I said, meet me at this person's house. We're hanging out. And like we didn't really talk about what was happening. Like we just hung out and we shared like our friendship, and like I would dip into things here and there, and like, but then we would get back at it and we would just laugh. And like that was the most helpful thing for me. It was like, you guys are my friends, you guys are with me, and like this is a thing that's happening, and I want to talk about it a little bit, but I just kind of want to like have friends around me when you feel lonely and isolated, you know?
I love that.
Yeah.
So okay, so did that change how you, like, as you were going through it, I guess, how did that affect you as a pastor? And the reason I ask is this was a while back, but I like went to this evening service with one of my friends at a church, and the pastor was like, as you guys all know, I'm going through a divorce. He was like, and it's affecting all of us. And I was like, I'm not loving this vibe. Like, I feel like you want the whole church to just like be in your divorce with you. And I've never been through a divorce, so maybe that's callous of me to say, but I thought that was a lot.
Yeah, I think I wasn't at that service, so I don't know exactly what happened. There's I find value in transparency, right? And like being like, this is what's happening. To say like, to keep it all under the rug, I think that would be the wrong decision. When I went through my divorce though, like I was not in upfront leadership. Like I wasn't like preaching, and I wasn't like doing the welcome, and I was still doing like really good and important things at the life of our church and leading certain things up front, but not in the same capacity I was. And it wasn't a punishment. It was like, I just like, this is too raw. And so like, I'm going to be like talking about grace and communion and like burst out bawling because I haven't processed my emotions, right? Or I'm going to write a sermon and it's going to be about like just my divorce. And so like, there is a level of awareness to be like, there's probably a season to transition out of like fully leading in the capacity you did so you can heal. And I think that's what I really needed, because I needed to heal. And like I think a lot of churches would be like, just run hard and keep going and like push it down. And good churches like the one I was at, the Gathering, were like, we're going to create a space for you to heal and heal well. But that being said, when I got appointed the way Methodists work, right? We get appointed, and I moved because it was like becoming a little bit clear that like pastoring in the exact same community that my ex-wife lived in, a congregation of people that were like, whose friend am I going to be? Probably wasn't going to be healthy for them.
Yeah.
I think emotionally I could have done it, and now years later it's like I'm still friends with all these people and things have like settled out, but in that season like it probably wasn't right.
Yeah.
But I remember my first sermon, like I had talked about what it looks like to like navigate the dark night of the soul, and but I didn't say like, and mine is going through a divorce right now. And so I think it shifted, like my sermons got darker for a while.
Yeah.
And the way that I process things got darker, but I don't think that it was bad. And but again, like I wasn't like just blasting from the mountaintops, like, hey, I go through divorce. I remember I met the board of the church I was coming to, and I was like introducing my family, and I didn't have a wife at this time. And so I was like, and these are my 2 kids, and like, this is us. And just this woman, and we're good friends now.
Yeah.
Before across the table, she's like, and now where's your beautiful wife?
Oh my God.
And I was like, I tried to give you every option and like clue to be like, and there's probably not a wife in the picture of this. So that's part of the reason it's like when you don't talk about it, it creates like opportunities for people to like accidentally step on a landmine. But then if you only talk about it, like if I was the pastor, it's like everything was through the lens of my divorce, that just wouldn't be helpful.
Right. It feels a little bit like trauma dumping on your congregation. Like I feel like that's the difference between transparency versus like, I'm just going to let you guys know all my shit.
Yeah. And I'm a firm believer in that. Like I think that if something happens to you, processing it with your and not pretending like everything's okay is a good thing.
Absolutely.
But I think in your 20-minute sermon, it's maybe not the best place to do it. And I think and weaving it into it. But for me as like a preacher, it's like if the message is more about my crap than the gospel, then it's just a message for me trauma dumping on people. And I think like that's where I can see it getting sticky, if like you will leave and you're like, well, I know a lot more about the crap my pastor is going through, but like I heard nothing about the hope of the gospel. It's like, then it probably wasn't a useful help of your time or the congregation's time to gather for that specific sake.
So before we get to like what, like I'm thinking about your term, like the dark night of the soul, like kind of want to know what that was like in both how maybe that shifted your view of God, but also like, did it shift your view of you at all? I've never been divorced, but I feel like it would be hard to not like take it personally. That's not the right way to say it. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I took it very personally. We laugh so we don't cry.
I'm terrible. Do you take it personally, the divorce?
So my view of God.
Are you skipping over?
I'll do the second one.
Okay.
Yeah. So because you asked how my view of God and self shifted, kind of was right. You said right.
Yeah.
So my view of God didn't like radically shift, like because the things that were happening to me, I didn't believe were like God willing those things to happen to me, and so like I still believe there was a good God that was orchestrating something in the midst of crap. Like so I didn't lose that, but I will say that like I've never really in the 8 years of my life up to that point relied on God too heavily because I just didn't have anything hard happen. And so I experienced a much more gracious and caring God because I like finally turned things over to God. And so that was like an experience that I had never done before. I would just like white knuckling it for 28 years. You know? And so like that was good. And so I was very easily able to separate from this terrible thing is happening to me. God is not making these things happen. And that was important for me because those never really got intermingled. Yeah. Now on a personal and identity basis, it was a nightmare. Funny. Sorry. I was a pastor, I was a husband, and I was a father. Like that's what I knew myself as.
One of the Theo bros, like in your Twitter.
Yeah.
Husband, father.
Yeah, pastor. That is actually my Twitter bio. So, and I have emojis for all of my kids. Well, you'd be one of the 7 people to follow me that now unfollows me. So there was a huge shift in that. Like that was really hard for me. Also, I don't know if I've ever said this before to you or on the podcast, but like I had a goal that like by the time I was 30, I was gonna have started the church, finished seminary, and get ordained. And getting divorced made it so that wasn't gonna happen. And
at what age did you get divorced?
Like 28 or 29.
Okay.
So because of that happening, it pushed everything back to 31. And like, which is not a big deal, but like when you set a goal that you've been after for a decade and you've been like knocking things down to make it happen and moving towards that, and your purpose of what you've been searching for is like clearly in front of you, and then you watch the finish line get pushed back further. That's hard to process with.
Yeah.
Also, like my identity was the Webster Groves married pastor with kids. I was like the cookie cutter version of what a Webster Groves family looked like and what a pastor in that community would look like. And so then I watched all of the things that defined my identity. Like I was no longer an upfront pastor. Like, so I've lost that part of my identity. I'm no longer a married person. I'm like, and I see my kids half the time. And so like all the things that I clung to as identity makers, not to mention I tore my ACL the day before we had decided I was getting divorced. So I couldn't do anything physically active. And so like I had like a physically I was broken, emotionally, spiritually, like everything was kind of broken and shifted. And so I had a whole 2 years, 18 months of like what does it mean to be Danny who doesn't play basketball 4 nights a week? What does it mean to be Danny who doesn't have his kids with him all the time and gets to play with them in that way? What does it mean to be Danny who's not preaching all the time or doing the work of a pastor? So it was hard. And then I went to a different church that I loved, but it was like very different from the kind of church of that. And so then I had to figure out like, well, what kind of pastor am I once I re-stepped back into that? And then I was a father to my kids half the time. So how do I be 100% of the dad I want to be 50% of the time, right? Like, how do you do that? And then trying to rebuild community and define like, who were my people, who were just my friends because we were couple friends, like who are the people, like how do I build new community and not like just leave the old person I was, but try to figure out who I actually am. Like there was a lot of searching and shedding away of things that I used to be. And so it was difficult. And now, like, I mean, I still like, it's been years and I still run into people like Schnooks and who just don't know I'm divorced. They'll be like, how's your ex-wife? They won't say that, they'll say her name. But I'll be like, I'm pretty sure she's doing great. Like, I don't know how to respond to that. Right. And so it's less frequent, but that's the kind of stuff that makes it difficult. I will say a funny thing is like, now that I've been divorced, I remember I was at a kid's soccer game and I saw 2 parents and they were like standing on opposite sides. And I went over to my wife, Annie. I was like, I wonder if they're going through some stuff. And so now I like see people and I'm like, my mind goes to like a more negative place when I see like nonverbal communication and body language. It's so just funny to see. And they were doing great. They're not getting divorced at all. The couple I saw, they were crushing it.
That's what they told you.
That's what they told me.
We all know what was that. We don't know. But it's interesting as you talk though, because like, I'm not to make this about me, but all these things you're saying about how you processed who you were are pretty much all things I've said on this podcast.
Yeah.
How like, because we've talked about how in a lot of ways deconstruction can feel like a divorce. Yeah,
I think 100%. Like, yes. And so I think we should talk about you and the connection to that, because I do like part of it. And that's why I've said it before. I think they're very similar things, because especially for you, right? You're divorcing something that you were almost quite literally married to. Yeah. And so the same levels of identity and trauma and pain and frustration and searching, wandering, all of that, like, I think though the mechanism for it happening looks different and the thing you were married to is different, like I see a lot of similarities between the two. And I think that's why people reach out in the DMs that have gone through divorce, but their messages don't sound probably too different from someone that's divorcing from fundamentalism or Calvinism, because like they're going through very similar things. And sometimes so my divorce didn't lead to spiritual deconstruction, right? Okay. So I will say that, like, identity deconstruction. And so I think that's an interesting thing to process too, is like, what is divorce leading you to deconstruct? And that's even something we've talked about in yours, is like, are you deconstructing the church or what the church told you, or who God is and who Jesus, like, because I think even in deconstruction, it's such a broad umbrella.
Absolutely.
And when people say it, they're like, it's one size fits all. And it's just so much not that.
No, it's not. So, okay, but I guess like, I mean, in some ways, Danny, I would say like I'm in that like dark night of the soul, processing who I am. Like, who am I without all these things?
Yeah.
So how did you like climb out of that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think again, like I had a lot of really good friends around me. I had a lot of really good people. I didn't rush it. So like in terms of like dating again, like I didn't rush dating. Yeah. Like I really was like, so my wife, Annie, people tried to set me up with her before the ink on the divorce papers dried. They're like, hey, I got this girl. It's like,
they were kind of rooting for it.
Yeah, they kind of were. Like, I was like, can I get divorced first? And so I set these like arbitrary rules of like, I'm not going to reach out till this time. And I did. But it was part of me being like, not knowing exactly when healing would start for dating. But like, I'm going to give myself some realistic time to not, because like I was, and this will connect to your deconstruction. Like I was always, from as long as I can, from 15 till when I got divorced, I was in a relationship with somebody.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And so I think like what's interesting for you is like you went from the church experience you were in a relationship with that church, and then you deconstructed it, and then you immediately hop back into it with the well.
Yeah.
And then,
I was thinking that.
And I think now, like, and this isn't to like change, like, but you're like a little less involved in what you're doing. You're like, you're preaching as much, you're not doing, and you're not there as much. But I think that's not an unwise thing to do, because it's jumping from one relationship to another. And dating, we would never say is healthy. And so I think giving yourself time to process is not an unhealthy thing. But like, we can often be told like there would be people in your space, and I would love to see you in church. Like I think it's great to see you there. And I think there are people who be like, you should be in church. But taking a break from things in other aspects of life, we would never bat an eye at, right?
Wow.
And in this situation, it seems like it's a healthy thing for people to do. And for you or anyone listening, I think that's like jumping back in just because you think it's what you're supposed to do is not probably the healthiest thing to do, at least at that moment, and trying to find ways to be healthy before you dive back in.
Like I'm imagining if you would have reached out to Annie before the divorce papers were signed. Like you and Annie are a great fit. And I think in a lot of ways, me and the well are a great fit. Like it was immediately I was like, oh, this is a good thing and a good connect. You probably would have been like, we get along really well. Yeah. But if you hadn't healed and processed, it would probably feel overwhelming really quickly, or.
Yeah. Well, like both of us had gone through divorces, and like we realized we had some conversations about our experiences and the similarities, but months in we were like, we had named this, like patting ourselves on the back. We're like, it seems like we're pretty healthy, because it's like our conversations don't just revolve around where we used to be. It's about the excitement of where we are going to go and what we're going to cultivate together. Oh. And I think that is a sign of on health in both dating and faith. It's like if your conversation and what you're talking about is more about what has happened, it's probably a sign you haven't healed from where you've been yet, and might be a yellow light to say, is it the right time to jump back into anything yet if I'm still so caught up in what happened?
Yeah, and if you still need to talk about it, that doesn't mean you're wrong to do that. Like that's part of processing.
Yeah, we still talk about things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the tone of it, like we talk about parts of her story, my story. Like our kids just found out that Annie had been divorced because we had like never talked about it.
Yeah,
because it's like it never.
It'd be weird to bring up.
Yeah, it's like, but we were also surprised we had never told them. But it opened up conversation with them and with us about divorce and like so there are times that it comes up and times where it makes a lot of sense. But if it's like the pastor who's trauma dumping, right, like on the stage, I think that's a sign that maybe it's not coming out of a place of like pure health. But never talking about it is also not healthy.
Absolutely.
And that's why therapy is important. Go to therapy.
Not Danny's therapist.
No, my therapist.
Reference to season 1. I don't remember which episode.
Yeah. I bet you episode 2.
No. We weren't at that table. Anyway. I think this was like really good, and I hope that it's helpful to people.
Me too. I think there is from my perspective, whether it's divorce or your deconstruction or whatever. I mean, that's the whole reason we're doing this podcast, is like your story is helpful for others, but also for you and for me and us to have this conversation. So I feel very similarly about like my divorce. There's no reason to not dive into it for the sake of like helping others. And I think if it does, and we're having people reach out because of it, but also being able to connect it. This is a deconstruction podcast, not a Danny's divorce podcast. And I think we did a good job connecting it to deconstruction, or you did, in the sense that it's like these emotions can feel similar. And sometimes I think it's helpful to have an image that's more clearly defined to try to like compare things to. And I think even though they're not exactly a 1-for-1, having the idea of like, well, maybe I've been through divorce and I know what that feels like. My deconstruction might follow a similar trajectory.
And they may be more intermingled. Like, I think a lot of people get divorced and then their church community changes, kind of like yours did, like differently. But like, and then that can lead to a sense of spiritual, especially if you're maybe not in a congregation that's very divorce affirming. Like, we haven't told this story on here, but I told someone where I was going to church and she was like, do you know Danny is divorced? And I was like, yeah. She was like, well, I just could never go to a church with a divorced pastor. And I was like, well, good for you, man.
Good for you.
He's a great pastor to me. Like, I was like that can mess things up.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. I wonder, this is just popped in my mind as you're talking, like, are most of the people reaching out to you women that are going through divorce? Because I also say churches, from the conversation I've had with divorced women especially, the church oftentimes rallies more around the men, and it can feel really isolating to women. And I think that, not always the case, but at least anecdotally from the conversations I've had, that has been the case in almost every conversation. And so sometimes I wonder if that leads to some of those deconstruction in faith moments, because you're watching the community you thought was going to have your back. They not only rally around the person that is on the other side of now this tension you're in, but then they're nowhere to be found for you. And I think that could be very traumatic for someone that had this whole community they thought was like going to be their people, and then they don't have that anymore.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean, we've gotten some comments of like, but if you're relying on people for your faith, then like people will fail you. But it's like, that's not really what we're saying. Usually something's happened and then you lost people and then you're kind of like, well, screw you guys.
Yeah. Well, it's also, it's like, yeah, sure, my faith in Jesus hasn't waned, but it's like, it doesn't make my lack of faith in people less painful when they mess up and hurt me. And so it's like, those things, again, don't have to be connected. Absolutely.
I agree with that.
We're close enough now on our new set we can fist bump.
I know. Wow. If I don't know how long it's been, even a little bit.
I think it's been long enough.
Time. I'm gonna let you close out today. What is something that you would encourage either someone going through a divorce or deconstruction or both?
Yeah, I think that I would find your people. And it doesn't have to be the people that have always been your people. My hope and prayer would be some similarity between that, so you don't have to find all new people, because we've talked about how exhausting it is to find new people. But I think I'm a firm believer in God designed us to live life in community, and when bad things happen, community should be the people that are going to help us navigate that. And so find people, and also like be okay where you're at. Like, don't rush it. Don't try to get through it because it's what you're told to do. Like, take your time and know that it might be months and might be years, but taking your time is going to be what's most healthy, the most healthy for you, but also in marriage or your church life or whatever, most healthy for your future partner down the road.
Wow.
Like, rushing it's not going to do anyone any good.
Oh, that's a word. All right. Well, thank you for taking some time to just like share your story. I know that's kind of vulnerable. I appreciate that you did it.
I got to be in the hot seat this time.
Yeah, you did.
It was
fun.
And
everybody, thanks for listening, and embrace the journey.
This is a Chapel Media podcast.